So hello and good afternoon from ECFR. My name is Kadri Liik. I'm Senior Policy Fellow with Wider Europe program at ECFR. And it is my pleasure today to be discussing a new paper by my colleague Mikhail Komin that focuses on ideology in Russia. How has it developed? How has it changed since the full-scale war started? And what are the practical implications of it? I don't know if you have had time to read Mikhail's paper. If not yet, then I definitely recommend. I think it's a really good paper. And Russian ideology, that is, a topic that is sometimes complicated to understand. We see a lot of simplistic understandings, interpretations, and sometimes excessive mysticism. I think Mikhail has explained in a very clear and rational language what it is about and what it means. And for discussion, we are joined by two more people, Ksenia and Luchenko, who is also visiting fellow at ECFR, and we are really happy that we have these Russian fellows from Russians in exile. And secondly, we are joined by András Tóth-Czifra, who is analyst with Foreign Policy Research Institute. So they will offer their comments, and afterwards, everyone will be able to ask questions as well through the Q&A functions. And I will try to give my best as moderator. So I think we will start, of course, from Mikhail. Why don't you give us a short overview of your paper, the main points you make, why the paper was needed, and what should we know about it, please?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kadri, for giving me the floor. I'll try to be with my presentation for today as short as possible. Also, because yeah, you're right that my speech today was based on this policy brief which I published recently, but also because I would like to give some space for the discussion about these issues which I would like to raise about Russian ideology and how it can be interpreted in terms of foreign policy in Russia. Yeah. So I will omit a lot of technical things like methodology and so on and so forth. You can drop a look on it in the policy brief. So I will focus on the main points. Yeah. So, but I would like to start with maybe two recent cases, not with the which was more modern. Yeah. So over the past, I guess, 2 weeks, two different rectors of Russian universities have given large and I can say maybe program interviews to the media. The first one on the left part of the slide is Nikita Anisimov. He is the rector of the High School of Economics. This is a state university, my alma mater, by the way. And for a long time, it was considered in the most liberal, or one of the most liberal and the most effective in the humanitarian disciplines, including sociology, political science, economics, and so on and so forth. And the university cooperated a lot with the West, invited for very basic pro-Western oriented stuff. But Nikita Anisimov gave an interview to the state media from so-called Lugansk People Republic. So this is the part of Ukraine now occupied by Russia. And in this interview, he told how High School of Economics help Lugansk universities adopt to Russian realities. Help to raise these funds for drones for Russian soldiers, for example, and in particular states the phrase that you can see on the screen now, my slides, I mean, that about these civilizational changes that are taking place on the front line. Yeah. The second case which I would like to present today is the interview was given by Vadim Volkov, the rector of the European University in St. Petersburg. This is a private university, and It is until, I guess, mainly 2022, it is developed humanitarian master's programs in cooperation with the European and American universities, for example, with Bard College, with the European University Institute in Florence, and so on and so forth. But in this interview, Volkov said that these programs are now closed. And instead of it, the university is developing non-political disciplines like computer data science, computer data analysis, epidemiology. Some declared that the West is intentionally organizing a brain drain from Russia, which, in his opinion, is, you see this on the slide, damaging fatherland. So I put these examples of interviews on the first slide because they both, as I think, show how many, including, previously liberal and pro-Western organizations or individuals in Russia, now need to adjust to the Kremlin's renewed ideology and demonstrate that they are in tune with the new narratives. First of all, anti-Western sentiment, belief in Russia as a civilizational state, and some others. So if we can talk more about these narratives, if we also carefully study last Russian strategic documents, like some doctrines and so on and so forth, and also Vladimir Putin's articles, his addresses to the nation, interviews and speeches by other members of the Russian elites, we can see that this ideology in Russia has become more coherent, and in recent years, I mean, after 2022, and now is based on 3 key pillars. And the first and the most important pillar is the idea of the state civilization. It's not easy to explain in a few words what does it mean, but I try. So this concept posits that there are some unique or specific civilizations or state civilization, among others, distinguished by their authenticity, some unique characteristics. And this authenticity means the capacity for the independent creation of values, culture, and institutions without borrowing or copying from other civilizations. And Russia, of course, declares themselves as one of such civilization, and its unique feature is the desire of the nation and the state to absolute sovereignty. Yeah, the sovereignty is a really old concept for the Putin's Russia. And so, being as a civilization state, Russia protects its values from what they called in different doctrines destructive ideological influence of other states, primarily from the West civilizations and from the West states, which is also important that according to this state civilization concept, the current state borders may not coincide with the borders of the state civilization. Yeah, in the Kremlin view, this is a big. There is existing the big historical Russia, and for example, the Russian war in Ukraine is an attempt to bring the part of Ukraine back within the borders of these big historical Russia and Russian civilizations, and to rid Ukraine from the influence of the Western civilization. This is the first pillar. The second pillar, maybe less specific, but specific enough, is raised around the values, which is unique to the Russian civilization. Yeah. In 2022, maybe you know that Russia adopted a decree on traditional, so-called traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. And through such mandates, the Kremlin crafts the archetype of the ideal Russian citizen. This is someone who establishes a strong family, strong conservative family, upholds patriotism and service to the fatherland, as Vadim Volkov now, as I understand, Also, this person prefers collectivism and collective values, collective goods over the individualism, which is referred to the West. But while the Kremlin has been promoting the conservative traditional family for a long time, so we partly aware about it, the concept of patriotism has undergone a major development, I guess. So firstly, patriotism has transitions from a state encourage exception to some kind of norm, the new norm. Now the state expects from citizens to display patriotism by engaging in activities by the government. And second, which is important to the Kremlin, broaden the domains of the patriotism. So now it is also related to the private life of the Russian citizen. For example, to be patriot is in today's Russia is also mean to have this large family with many children and do some other conservative stuff. And the third pillar, and maybe the most new one and less popular, is anti-colonialism narrative. The Kremlin seeks to recast Russia's international image, portraying Russia as the leader of oppressed countries. First of all, the countries from the global south, especially in Africa. And this aspect is related to Russia's legacy as a successor of the Soviet Union in combating Western, especially American colonialism. So for doing that, the Kremlin elaborated quite all his approach for reinterpreting on the level of the United Nations Organization, the human rights, through the lenses again of traditional values. Yeah. So also the Kremlin, according to this concept, according to this narrative, blames the West for neo-colonialism, claiming that the West now imposes allegedly universal political and economic institutions, first of all, democratic institutions, on other countries, which is not ready to have it, or which is not obligatory to have it because of their spiritual and traditional values. So all these three narratives, the Kremlin also uses to explain that now in Ukraine, Russia is not just leading an aggressive war for territory, yeah, but this war is only one of episode of the global spiritual confrontation between Russian civilization and the West. However, I think is maybe more important change that has taken place in Russia, not only the coherency of the Russian ideology, but also the developing of the new infrastructure to promote it. Previously, I guess you know that the Kremlin promoted the ideological narrative through state media. First of all, some kind of large cultural project like festivals of films, maybe, yeah. And through, of course, some non-state agents like Russian Orthodox Church. But since 2022, the Kremlin has been actively introducing ideology into primary and secondary education, in the universities, and in the healthcare system. So Russian schools now have introduced a new subject, a new lessons. The name is Conversation about Important Things, or Conversation about Important. It takes place every Monday, and it follows by the compulsory or mandatory school-wide assembly, where Russian national anthem and the flag raising ceremony is also existing. Yeah. So during after this specific ceremony. During these lessons, teachers explores different topics, but mostly this is ideological topics like traditional family values, why it is important to Russia, who is Russian real allies, meaning Belarus, the BRICS countries, and the Global South, of course. Also, there are some topics about the annexation of the Crimea and so on and so forth. This is one of the key example of how ideology penetrate to the school system. The second example is and which is effectively supports the conversation about important things, is the course of Russian history lessons, which now are taught using a new textbook written by one of the Putin's most, I guess, ideologized advisor, Vladimir Medinsky. So the new Russian history textbook places much more emphasis on the uniqueness of Russia as a civilization and the historical confrontation between Russia and the West. And moreover, which I find very important and which you can see in the slide, in this figure, moreover, that the Second World War and the war in Ukraine now in this new history textbook are described in the same terms of the fight against Nazism. So you see that these narratives are mixed in the figure here. Yeah, so as you can see. Also, the Kremlin has introduced several initiatives that allows it to control the out-of-school activities, not only the in-schools activities, but out-of-school activities. So also these initiatives mostly similar to the Soviet pioneers and Znanie Society. So more details you can find in the policy briefs. About the higher education, so a key tool for ideologization across Russian university is also mandatory course named Fundamentals of the Russian Statehood. So the Russian Ministry of Higher Education mandated that this course should take place in the first semester for all first year bachelor degree students. So the half of the year on the first year, the half of the year. One of the officials from Federal University on the ECFR workshop in December has characterized this course as encapsulating the Russian political class interpretation of Russia's past, present, and future. And I think it is very good quote, yeah, and very good thinking. During the course, for example, students explore Russia's history and geography from the perspective of Russia as a state civilization and delve into traits attributed to the Russia's people, such as solidarity, spiritual harmony, unity, healthy conservatism, and some others. In addition, the Kremlin is piloting the introduction of other ideologically loaded lessons in all universities for Russia. In Russia, for example, this is the basic of military training, which now is developing in some Russian universities and several Russian universities. Also, there are existing now the service learning courses, which promotes some kind of state's version of the patriotism. And a significant post February 2022 development in ideological infrastructure in universities is the establishment of these specific centers. You can see the name of it on the slide. Yeah, these centers collaborate with regional anti-terrorism committees, which, by the way, organized by the Federal Security Service in Russia, and are officially called upon to control deviant, from the Kremlin's, of course, point of view, student activity. So the state regulation of social and private life, it is more, I think, popular and more famous. So I can briefly name the laws which was introduced in Russia last 2 years. The law prohibiting gender transition, not the laws, but LGBT movement now classified as an extremist organization. Also, there are some kind of discussion inside of Russia, inside of Russian parliament and Russian elites about imposing abortion restrictions last year, but hopefully, and it's very happy to all Russian women that it's not introduced in Russia now, I mean the abortion of the law. But also, which is maybe more important, and we see now, this is a new wave of state programs in Russia. They call it the national project. These state programs supporting and promoting the large families, which is a part of the Russian ideology now. Yep. So, and to the conclusion, I think that key finding maybe and takeaway messages to the discussion is, I would like to formulate it is in that way. So first of all, the role of the ideology in the Russian political system has increased. And whereas previously the Kremlin used ideology ad hoc, some kind of juggling narratives for its own benefit. Now as I see it, increasingly acts as a tool of regulation and control, and this applies both to the broader populace and to different categories of elites. This switch, I think, didn't happen by accident. It is partly the rational strategy of the Kremlin, because it needs stronger ideological control. Because I guess the Kremlin met, if not resistance, if not active resistance, yeah, but at least not very active support in society and elites for the war in Ukraine, especially during the first year of the war, during 2022. And the rejection of the war was particularly strong among young people. And the Kremlin decided that it had lost the war for their minds for young people to the West, and therefore tried to increase the degree, the level of ideologization in primary and secondary education. But not only there, as you can see. Also, more active implementation of this renewed ideology and infrastructure for it in the short term will not be very effective, as I can say. At the current stage, the Kremlin needs this performative support. This is the definition from András Tóth-Czifra, our speaker during this discussion too. Yeah. So what does it mean, that performative support? This is the support not so active from populace to Kremlin initiative, but the level of its support which provide Kremlin to adjust their war machine in quite effective way. Yeah. And this is on the short-term perspective. On the long-term perspective, I think that the picture is much gloomier, because I believe that there is a risk, real risk, that the new Putin generation will grow up in Russia, or will emerge in Russia. And this new generation will be more conservative, more negative against to the West, believe in Russia's historical mission as a civilization state, and share much more traditional ideas about the family, gender roles, and negative attitudes towards LGBT people. And this is very gloomy perspective of the Russia's future, because if this Putin's generation will grow up, the perspective of the future democratic Russia, of course, will decrease. In case we will have some kind of window of opportunity, these groups, this new group among youth, will be in opposition to our intents to build democratic Russia. So I would like to wrap up here. Thank you so much. Hope that it will be not so boring and long.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. It's a fascinating study. And maybe I will use my position as moderator to ask some questions before I hand it over to the commentators. And I actually had two questions. One is exactly about how does it work? I grew up in the Soviet Union, and in the conditions that were maybe not politically entirely similar, but definitely state-sponsored ideology was part of my everyday life in school time. And for us, it very clearly had completely opposite effect. I mean, it made us deeply ironic about everything Soviet. And I think it was the case also in Russia, because I grew up in Estonia, and that was definitely slightly different. In Russia, however, it was somehow the dualistic attitude. On one level, or maybe among certain people, the communist truths also got laughed at, quite like in Estonia. But on another level, some sort of great power ideology, the notion of being in competition with the United States, some anti-capitalist credo. I mean, these things clearly survived among certain layers of Russian population, as was later also testified by researchers from Levada Center. So it sort of seems to echo your take that on short-term effects will not be that noticeable, but longer term you will get Putin generation. So maybe you could talk a little bit more, where is Putin generation will come from? What will that be, a sort of direct result of ideology, or could it be that the ideology as sponsored by the state gets discredited, however certain great power style thinking will nonetheless be there, and one of the thinking trends that that will affect Russia's future? Mikhail, would you maybe you would like to answer, and then
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
I was muted. I started answer, but I was muted. Yeah. Sorry for that. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Unfortunately, I can't compare with the Soviet period of times in terms of my personal perspective.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is not unfortunate. I mean, you are lucky to be so much younger.
Yes, I guess, yes. But so what I can see on that perspective, of course, you are partly right that according to the ideological increasement, yeah, so the growing up in different institutions in Russia, especially in the second and primary education, there are some kind of opposition to it, yeah. So, for example, not every teacher would like to teach their pupils, their students, this conversation about important, yeah. But what, in my perspective, the problem is that now the Kremlin try to control all life, all daily life of the Russian students, especially at schools. How they try to do it? They, of course, control the school activities, but after that, it tried to involve students through the schools in out-of-school activities, like this new pioneer movement, the movement of the first. And if you are live in a big city and you have quite good income, you will have the alternative to all of these out-of-school activities. But if you live not in a big city, so in average Russian city, yeah, or in a small city or in a village, of course you will be involved more and more. And this infrastructure increase the chance that increase the chance and increase the percentage of the people who will be more aligned with the Kremlin's ideology. Of course, not all of them will be real Putinists, but the level of the pressure by government to be the Putinist, yeah, now increased, and we will see some kind of result, especially in the long-term perspective. Also, I would like to add that the problem is that this new ideology, especially if we compare it with the Soviet period of time, now support with the different instruments that the Kremlin have to build the more loyal community, more loyal society. First of all, money and cooptation, but also the level of propaganda is increased too. Yeah, and combining all this or mixing all these new instruments, I guess more than we will have before, more than before 2022. So of course we can't expect, I guess, the level of the ideology which was in the early Soviet period of time. But at the end of the USSR, the ideology was the level of the ideologization of elites and the community was quite big. Not so, of course, and this is the reason why the USSR collapsed also, but it was quite large. And we will see the increase in this role of the ideology, which decrease our chances to see this democratic Russia's future.
Thanks. Depressing, but makes sense. My second question, however, is about national minorities, or how does that new ideology square with Russia being a multinational country? And to me, it's been obvious that for the bulk of his time in Kremlin, Putin has not been ethnic nationalist. He has been a great power nationalist. I mean, statism, great power nationalism has always been part of his ideological credo. However, he has always avoided being ethnic nationalist. I think the first time we got that from him was indeed in 2014 in his speech where he announced annexation of Crimea. That was justified with ethnic arguments. But then for a long time, that seemed like one-off. It sort of disappeared again. And now, however, this new ideology, civilization state, historical Russia, that indeed puts much bigger emphasis on ethnic elements or, tribal, Slavic tribes of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine. So do you think it will have, I mean, does Kremlin need to also think about the risks it is creating in its relationship with other nationalities of Russia, or is that something they can actually dismiss?
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. It's a very interesting question again. So I have one case and one argument. The first case is that maybe you heard about that, that right after the introduction of the new history textbook, in 2022, I mean. Ramzan Kadyrov was very disappointed on this textbook because of the chapter about Chechnya and the repressions on Chechnya during the 18th and 19th century, yeah, and 20th century too, in the Soviet period of time, I mean. And he blamed the author of this textbook, Vladimir Bedinsky, that he is some kind of nationalist, yeah. Which ends up that Russian Minister of Higher Education, of school education, I guess, not a high school education, but of school education, yeah, need to arrive to Chechen Republic and demonstrate how the Kremlin rewrite this chapter in the textbook according to the position of the Ramzan Kadyrov about Chechen people repression during several centuries in Russian history. And of course, these cases demonstrate that national minority, are not so happy with these new narratives, yeah, especially because, of course, there are a lot of pro-Slavic orientation, not only in the history textbook, but also in the narratives, which we can see from other resources too. But you see that there is no so many instruments to influence on them for them to correct this path. Okay, the grievances, I guess, will be increased, but you know that the grievances, for example, in Republic of Tatarstan was increased right after the Kremlin decided to prohibit or decrease the level of the school education in the Tatar language, for example. Yeah, so it's happened during Putin's period of time. A lot of cases there were. Yeah. And all of these cases, of course, increase the grievances among national minority, but can't can influence a lot on the policy. Yeah, and this is the case answer. The argument answer, I guess that you are right. The Kremlin tried to build now not only now, but it tries to build it last 10 maybe years, the new nation, the new more united nation, which is united all nationalities in Russia and all religion. And it is underlined or highlights this position through all documents. So in that case, I guess that so in the mind of the Kremlin, it's really, they understand that the ideology of Russia should be include multi-language, multipolarity, multi-ethnicity, something, and they try to do it. Yeah, not maybe so effective and not so effective way, but they keep in mind in it and somehow can manage with the problem which can be located in that issue.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, there is also a chance that some members of national minorities actually adopt Russian ideology and become more Russian than Russians themselves. We have seen examples of that as well. But I now stop abusing my position and I will give word to our two commentators, and the audience can start thinking about your questions and sending them through Q&A function. Some people have done already. Thank you. And over to you, Ksenia. What were your thoughts when you were reading Mikhail's excellent paper?
Yes, I would add something on the question about the generations, the young people that you asked. I remember the Soviet Union, not very well, but I do. And I've done a lot of work on the history of the dissident movement, so I have some personal experience. And I think that there is a big difference between the late Soviet Union and the nowadays Russia. Because in the Soviet Union, this ideology was very old and boring and stuffy, and it has no energy at all. And now there is a lot of energies in this new ideological theses, this aggression, militaristic style, and so on. And for some young people, it looks very interesting, and they can make careers on this. And we see all these kind of militaristic brotherhoods in big universities. They are sincere. It's not like Komsomol of the late Soviet Union, when young people were forced to, when they wanted to make careers, so they entered the Komsomol, and it was rather cynic. But now they do really believe this young people. Of course, then there is not. It's not very big. It's not a big community, but they are very aggressive, and they are sincere, and they influence their friends and acquaintances and so on. It looks like more like Nazi groups in the 30s in Germany than like the Soviet Union. But of course, if we speak about textbooks or school activities, they are also as boring as in the late Soviet Union, and those textbooks are unlikely to indoctrinate school children. So it will be the same experience of double thinking. And well, it's not good also, because even the most intelligent and most clever young people, they need to adapt. And this ability to adapt leads them to cynicism, hypocrisy, and conformism. It's also not good. But this is much more like the late Soviet Union. That would be my answer to your question to Mikhail. Now some comments. Of course, I absolutely agree with everything Mikhail said, and this is a great work that he does, that he did. But ideology is such a broad field that, of course, we can add and argue and think a lot about it. I would say that researchers have two opposing views of whether Putin's Russia has an ideology or not. Some believe that it does, others that there is no ideology. And I think that in this case, both sides are right. Because yes, on the one hand, we see everything that Mikhail described. And there was also a big policy brief by Maria Snegovaya about the ideology, Putin's ideology, and some other works. And there are a lot of practical projects that, for example, Telegram channels that observe all the publications of propagandists and ideologists. And it's also very interesting reading. On the other hand, this ideology is not codified in any way. In the constitution of the Russian Federation, unlike the Soviet Union's constitution, for example, there is no mention about any ideology. There is no single book to which one could refer where this ideology would be formulated. There are only fragmented, often contradictory, intuitive beliefs. This is more about mythology, I would say, the space of a big myth than an ideology. I think that we could frame it with the concept of civil religion that was introduced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 18th century. Rousseau needed to justify what would hold the nation together in the absence of God and monarchy and any sacral authority. And in this conception, civil religion is supported by the state and consists of certain values and rules that imply loyalty to the country. But at the same time, in private life, citizens can adhere to any beliefs. It's more about form than about content. The crucial point is to observe loyalty rituals. It's some kind of cult without dogma that refers even to the religious system of ancient Rome or something like that, where there were prescribed rituals, but the power, the authorities did not regulate what to believe, but they interpreted, the authorities had this power to interpret relationships with the gods and made sure that citizens didn't offend them. That's the same thing that Russian state now does with Christianity. They don't believe, but they watch to be sure that citizens don't offend gods, saints, priests, and so on. So there is no dogma, no codification, but a big, powerful myth. And the myth could be contradictory, fragmented, and it often includes these pseudo-historical narratives. And throughout his presidency, Putin tried to create a consistent narrative of Russian history, as Mikhail showed us, as the story of a great country that progresses from victory to victory, from Holy Russia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and now we have the culmination that brought all these incarnation of this saint Russian state together. Their synthesis is Russia under Putin. And all these statements, documents, textbooks that Mikhail describes are mosaic. It's some kind of patchwork of which this big myth is made. Each of Putin's ideologues, Dugin, Petro Kirill, Vladimir Solovyov, university rectors, authors of textbooks, and so on, they act intuitively. There is even some kind of a competition of ideas because they don't have this codified dogma or any, they don't have a text to refer. Russia is governed by informal practices, and ideological assertions are also rather intuitively felt than rationally described. And so it's possible to please the boss, the Putin, or to even to anger him. Because, for example, if we look at so-called voenkory, is war correspondents, pro-war bloggers, and patriotic community, we can suppose that they express Putin's ideology in a radical way. But in fact, they are almost as alien as liberals for the state. They are considered not much loyal than foreign agents, because for them, this ideology is valuable for its content. They really do believe in all these patriotic, militaristic things. And loyalty itself, it's not important. And they question loyalty by their deeds and their statements and their criticism towards, for example, Ministry of Defense and so on. And they are also perceived as a threat by the ruling elites, although they express the same ideology. And this ideology is rather secondary to propaganda. For propaganda to be effective in manipulating public sentiment, it must hit people's expectations, reinforcing them. And the content of propagandistic narratives coincides with sentiment, especially with resentment. And the core is therefore anti-Western sentiment and irrational fear of the other, from the other, the stranger. So this other is America, the West, and so on. And we can compare it with, for example, the Russian Empire's propaganda during the First World War, when this stranger, this other, was also the West, but not America, but the Germans. And so all these narratives of traditional values, Holy Rus, and so on, exist to differentiate this Russia from this other, to explain why we are not with the West. What is the difference, why we are opposed, why we are better than this awful other stranger. Well, I think I could stop here because it took me too long to, this commentary was too long, so, but I can answer maybe the questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ksenia. And I think I will come back to your questions as well. Over to András now. What were your impressions or things you want to emphasize, dispute, etc.?
Thank you very much for having me, and good afternoon to everyone. So my research interests concern state capacity and policymaking, how power is held, how power is exercised. So I was approaching Mikhail's study from this point of view, from this sort of practical point of view, how ideology is used to further practical goals. And he spoke a lot about this, so I'm not, probably, I hope I'm not going to repeat too many things, but the question that I asked myself is, why did the war accelerate the formation of this new ideology that he describes in this excellent study? And obviously, the 3-day special military operation, quote unquote, as it was originally likely planned, that would have fit the regime's earlier legitimation framework, which was efficiency. So if you look at how, for instance, the Syrian military campaign in support of Assad was portrayed in Russian media, in how the Russian government promoted the modernity of the Russian army, the efficiency of their operations in Syria. And again, like you use a lot of quotation marks here, but this is how it is promoted. Then you get a sense of what the original plans for the Ukraine military campaign might have been. Alas, we obviously now know that it did not work out that way. So as many of as others have stated this before me, the main purpose of this new emerging ideology was thus to make the regime as well placed as is possible for what they now think is a long confrontation with the West, through ensuring the control over the domestic elites and also avoiding social unrest. And paradoxically, domestically, this requires framing the war as something inevitable, but where victory is just around the corner. It's always one breakthrough away. This worked, I believe, for a while over the past 2 years, but a return to this promise of a return to normality or a return to something better than the current present, something that is just out of sight, has become more and more difficult to argue for, because the war is still going on with no real perspective of finishing or ending soon. So we have seen timeline shifts that were noticeable in the perception of the war in society, as well as on the level of political and economic elites. So for instance, in September 2022, the military mobilization. In 2023, which was perhaps a less clear split, but it was the whole economic reorientation, the forced trade pivot to Asia, the disruption of supply chains and so on, and of course, inflation. And in 2024, the acceptance of this long stalled war, the tax raises that are now codified, unlike the ideology, this aspect of the war is codified, that the government is going to need these resources on the long term. So whenever such a thing occurs, it is always a stress test of the regime's existing mechanisms to hold and exercise political power. So every time the political leadership has to ask themselves the question of how to tweak this sort of mix of domestic performance, spin, intimidation, and popular mobilization to serve its goals. And as long as domestic performance is a kind of given, as long as most of resources are focused on the war, you have to play with the other three. And here I return to Mikhail's study. She shows that some of we now identify as the regime's emerging ideology have deeper roots. The rehabilitation of Stalin in textbooks, the anti-Western rhetoric, the sort of civilizational imperialist rhetoric, as well as some of the conservative elements. But there are also other elements of this that are new, that the regime has had to make up on the fly over the past 2 years. So for instance, the Z propaganda, the so-called cultural clusters in that the government now expects for regional governments to implement, the glorification of war participants, for instance. These are all new. And if you look at deeper sociological surveys, also quantitative ones like, Russian field service, for instance, but also more qualitative ones like the Public Sociology Lab, you get the impression that these new things are not are much weaker ground, and they usually require a strong push from the authorities. And this push is sometimes there, sometimes it isn't. But you can also see that, for instance, certain ultra-conservative elements, and I think I'm also maybe answering already a question here from the audience, that there are some ultra-conservative elements that are raised and then, if not discarded, but at least not pushed, not elevated to official policies. So, for instance, the access to abortion, the death penalty, they were which in some regions and some politicians are supporting, and then others came out against them. And there is a social pushback, or a fear of social pushback, that prevents the Kremlin from pushing all of these new conservative elements through into a consistent new ultra-conservative ideology. What they are achieving, though, is norm setting, which is backed up by intimidation, repression. You can see this during the presidential election, after which all presidential candidates were invited to performatively support the war. Another thing is of course, the performative support that Mikhail mentioned, that I also mentioned in my reports for FPRI. And based on this, but also in a way separately from this, the war itself, or support of the war, becomes a kind of shibboleth, akin to a loyalty pledge. And here I agree with Ksenia that this is this calls into mind late Soviet ideology, so that you need to quote if you want to get ahead, to get scarce resources. Again, this is not a new thing. Researchers like Paul Good, for instance, have written about how elites are trying to mimic, conceal, outbid vague signs from the executive years before the war in different contexts. But this is the same thing. It's just that the war is now a central element of this. And well, to close out with, an important question is, to me, is what the limits of this ideology building on the fly are. So first, I think an ideology usually says something about the past and about the future. This emerging ideology doesn't really say anything about the future. I believe, and please forgive me if I'm misattributing this quote, but I think it was Andrei Kolesnikov who called it tyranny of the perpetual present. It provides cognitive crutches to people and to elites to explain developments in the world, in their closer surroundings even. But the enforcement of this dogma is very dependent on the repressive capacity of the regime. And that is currently, due to resource constraints, is focused on a set number of known threats. For instance, civil society, opposition movements, anti-war activism, and so on, even sometimes environmental activism. But frustration is still building up over the domestic costs of the war, the deaths, the covert mobilization, and it will ultimately look for an outlet. Now, when will this happen? We don't know. Will this happen? We don't know. But what we can infer from what has happened in Russia over the past years is that the system is not very well placed to react to these in its current state, and the government also hasn't found an effective way to explain this tension. And second, an ideology also mobilizes. In Russia's case, what we see, and again, the presidential election is a good example of this, is most people accepting the war as a constant, perhaps an opportunity even, perhaps a box to tick even, but that is not, but nothing more than that. The presidential election itself required massive rigging, even beyond the administrative capacities that were poured into mobilizing people. This is obviously not to say that there aren't many enthusiastic supporters of the war, from the Russian Orthodox Church to those who financially or politically benefit from the war, and there are many of them. Indeed, the Kremlin has consciously built a pro-war coalition, both within the elites and in society over the past year and a half. But this creates conflicts over resources, which at this point are still a shrinking pie, and it creates conflicts over privileges, policy goals that are there and that we cannot disregard. And this is also, by the way, that I write about in my new report for FPRI, and I will stop there.
Thanks a lot, András. Mikhail, do you want to quickly react to anything you have heard, or shall we go straight to questions? You're nodding. You want to react?
I can maybe briefly react on 2 points. First of all, this discussion which mentioned by Ksenia, so the discussion if the Russian ideology is really existed or not. So I'm quite aware about this discussion, frankly. Yeah. So, but I believe that, you know, this is the ideology is not the binary variable. So this is a continuum, obviously, and we see that the ideologization of the Russian regime and the instruments which ideology gives to Kremlin to control Russian elites and Russian populace increased for some last years. And if we look at the ideology as a continuum, we can declare that the ideology existing and the level of using of it, the Kremlin increased too. Yeah. So this is briefly answer on this big discussion, big discussion among Russian political scientists, not only Russian, but among other political scientists too. So, yeah, and the second point which I would like to erase and partly contradict with what András told last time. I agree, frankly, with all this limitation that you see to use the ideology in Russia. And also, I'm really happy that you mentioned this idea that this difference between how Russia explained the invasion to Syria in terms of efficiency. Yeah, efficiency was the part of the ideology, or of the maybe legitimization of these actions. Yeah, and how efficiency can be used now to do the same as they did with Syria. Yeah. But also, which maybe surprised me a little bit during this research, and I guess which is underestimated in some Western media and also in the political science field, that unfortunately the image of the future now is existing in Russia. So, for example, if you open this textbook of fundamentals of Russian statehood, as they call it, yeah, you can see that they present some kind of image of the future. What is the image is? This is the image of more fair and maybe more justice world when Russia plays a pivotal role as the alternative of the West. Yeah, and it sounds not so bad. So I can't you know, agree that there is no any image of the future. It's some kind of image of the future. Of course, there are a lot of thoughts, I think, among the elites that it sounds a little bit optimistic, a little bit optimistic. Yeah, because if you would like to be the new alternative to the West, first of all, you need to, you know, build some kind of relationship with China, which partly looks like you mostly is dependent to China than plays another role. Yeah. So, but they try to create this image of the future and try to present it in the different ideological infrastructure. And I think that when we usually think that there is no image of the future by Russian state, we suppose that because of this, really the ideology is really rooted into the history, but they now try to dive from the history and look around what's going on and what they would like to do. And I believe that maybe in next years this point of the ideology will be elaborated.
Thanks a lot. And now I'll go to questions. And the first question, I'm more than happy to ask it. Why the economic and civilizational success of the former Soviet republics that are now members of the EU does not put the Kremlin propaganda in doubt. I would like to also maybe to widen it a little bit. I was happy to ask it I've been working in Moscow as an Estonian journalist, and I remember that nothing positive Estonia did was ever. It never gained any prominence in Russian media. It was very rare. Yeah, maybe sometimes one or other journalist wrote a positive article, but in Estonia's economic reforms, or when Russia introduced flat tax, and that actually was a good thing, tax collection improved dramatically, and that was in early Putin time. And I remember people talking about where does flat tax work and work well, and they brought all sorts of odd examples, completely overlooking Estonia, that had actually become economically distinctly successful exactly by stuff, flat tax, easy, transparent tax system. So why are they neglecting? Examples from their closest neighbors, but also, to Russians look at any countries as models. I mean, you touch upon it in the paper, saying that state civilization means that the country, both leadership and population, reject foreign models. And there has always been something of that in Russia. On the other hand, certain things they imitate quite uncritically. They take sort of concepts over from the West and maybe use them in an uninformed manner. I think Isaiah Berlin has written about it very well, suggesting that, in the West, ideas are in competition with one another, and Russia is sort of so much isolated from the West that this competition, this lively exchange of ideas, is not felt in Russia. So when one or other Western idea reaches Russia, they took it excessively seriously and start implementing it. I think that was his take on Russian communism, why communism never happened in that way in the West as it did in Russia. And I think we have seen sort of imitation of Western everything from brands to ideas on multiple levels. So that is kind of contradiction. Russia rejects these things on one level, on the other is far less critical than one actually should. Mikhail.
Frankly, I'm not sure that I have a question. I have an answer on a question, but on a comment, I mean. But what I'm thinking last maybe a couple of weeks, and it is related to one of the questions from the audience, which I saw in the chat, that this neglecting of Russia's neglecting of some kind of success stories from other countries and imitating the processes of some kind of institutions which have West or not only institutions but organizations, that we see, especially in the beginning of the Putin terms. Now, I think that they try to avoid, more or less. So they try to build. They try to believe and to persuade all others. Countries, especially in the global south, that they can build a new, more fair world. And in that case, they don't need to have some kind of imitation or success stories or something like that. They try to do the new something which is unique feature or based on the unique feature which they present. So I'm not sure that this is the answer on your comments, but this is how I guess this Russian ideology progressing now.
Thanks a lot. I will soon get back to the global south, but there is actually also a question about abortion law as means of promoting big family. And abortion law, I mean, there is no abortion law in Russia, but there are private clinics that actually refuse to perform abortions. And that's an interesting case. I think Tatiana Stanovaya suggested that this is actually an occasion where propaganda has overtaken Putin and has gone further. And Putin himself, I think he intervened and said that this is not a necessary measure, banning all abortions. And Putin, of course, is largely the product of later stage of Soviet Union, and that abortion was actually fairly mainstream means of family planning. So I can easily see why Putin sees no problem, but people sort of heard that conservative music from the Kremlin, try to pick up the tune and then improvise as best as they could. So do you have any comments? And also I was thinking, I mean, Ksenia seemed to say that state ideology still largely leaves people on their own in their private life and choices, but abortion law would actually be a distinct break with that. That would actually be a thing that would be taken very seriously by most women.
Yeah, if I can start. So first of all, according to my counting, to March this year, 23 different Russian regions did some kind of restrictions to the abortions, mostly in the private clinics. So they prohibited to do in the private clinics or promote not to do it or try to influence on it or something like that. But 23 Russian regions. I try to understand what is the reason to do for that for these 23 regions, but not to do to others, several dozens. Yeah. And try to find either any pattern on it. Frankly, there's still some kind of pattern. But you're right that I agree with you and Tatiana Snova in that case that I think that when this discussion was started last year, at the end of this last year, in November and December usually is the most intense period of this discussion. Yeah. So the propaganda, but not mostly the propaganda, but some part of the Russian more conservative elites. First of all, Anna Kuznetsova, who was the child ombudsman in Russia before, but now she is the member of the State Duma. Yeah. So they try to promote this idea, but then understand that it is the broad Russian populace really would like to avoid these restrictions and see that it can be some kind of social tension, which is not so good, especially before the president election, which was happened in March. Yeah, and so I think it was stopped. But frankly, in the ideology perspective, is if we can look into this concept of conservative family, of course, according to the Russian Orthodox Church position or to some other conservative non-state actors in Russia, the abortion should be banned. Yeah, because if you would like to promote large family in Russia, you need to do something with abortion. And I guess that maybe not in short perspective, but in long perspective, some kind of restrictions can be adopted by Russian government, maybe in 10 or 12 years. Not a permanent ban or something like that, but some kind of different restrictions which will make the abortion less possible than now.
Thank you. Ksenia, I think you might want to comment on that as well. And I saw another question that is actually very fitting to ask Ksenia, the role of Orthodox Church in Russian nuclear doctrine. Ksenia is specialist in Orthodox Church, so maybe you have a few words on that as well. We're going a little bit over time, but seeing that the bulk of our audience is still with us, I hope we can afford it. But we will try to wrap up by past. So keep that in mind also when calibrating the length of your.
Yeah, about abortions. Well, both in Soviet Union and now in Russia, it was an instrument, and it is an instrument of power, of humiliation of women, and so on. In the Soviet Union, women could make abortions, and they did it, but it was I don't know how to translate. There was a special term even, карательная гинекология. It's like, it's a joke, a linguistic joke, comparing to psychiatric treatment of dissidents. This, the using of medicine for humiliating people and terrorizing people and so on, because there were no contraceptions, so women were forced to make abortions, but it was so humiliating, so painful. They had no medicines, no treatment, no no anesthesia and so on. And now that's vice versa. They try to ban abortions at all because they need women to be dependent. And that's also an instrument of power, of forcing people, of humiliating. And it's not about the value of life as they explain it on the ideological level. That's, I think, the crucial point about this. They don't believe in what they do. All these moral laws, they are not about their real morality and belief. I think that differs Russia from Islamic countries, for example, because there they more or less believe in what they do. But in Russia, it's just an instrument of forcing people, of loyalty, and these mechanisms are very different. So don't believe in what they are saying. that's what can I say. I just can explain. About the nuclear doctrine, it's a very big topic. Yeah, there is a book by Dmitry Adamsky about this history of the relation between the Russian Orthodox Church and this nuclear science and nuclear military forces. I have some maybe critics about this book, but it's not now today's topic. And yes, it's Sergei Kiriyenko who was in the beginning of all these events, because by coincidence, Sarov, the center of Russian nuclear science and where the bomb was invented, where Sakharov and Khariton invented the bomb and so on. It was a small town in Nizhny Novgorod region that in the Russian Empire was known as a sacred saint place, where one of the great saints were born, and not, he wasn't born there, but he lived there at the monastery in Sarov, Serafim Sarovsky. And when the perestroika began and the church wanted the sacred places back, they tried to establish a new relationship with the nuclear institute and with nuclear industry. And they invented this idea that this nuclear, how we call it, shield, it has a spiritual basis. So this mystification of nuclear weapons It was how the church explained why they need to be present there in Sarov. And at that time, Sergei Kiriyenko was the governor of Nizhny Novgorod region, and one of his great deeds there was this celebration where Putin came to Sarov, to the nuclear town, with these relics of Serafim Sarovsky and so on. Well, this is a very long story, but
yeah, Ksenia, I think your connection is pretty bad.
Shortly, that really the church has. Oh, sorry. Then
I think, yeah, Ksenia, I think your connection
maybe
is
we will continue this discussion.
Yeah, we was just going to say that we can hear you fairly badly, but we got the idea of what you replied. I'll take a few questions about Global South, because that's one of the topics you develop in the paper, Mikhail. It is asked, how is the Global South perceived by the Russian society, especially in the context of immigration policy and Russia's eagerness or lack of it to accept immigrants? And also, shouldn't it actually be pretty easy to show to the Global South that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is colonialism, not the opposite of it? I mean, Russia is trying to portray West as colonialist, but it should be easy to explain that actually Russia is engaging in that. Mikhail, why don't you reply, please? And then with the last questions, we will also get back to all of you, including András, and you can say final words.
Yeah, so see, about the first part, the immigration and the Global South. Frankly, I think that for most part of the Russian society, it's not the issue. So because there are not so a lot immigrants from the Global South, like African countries or Asian countries, to Russia to occupy the working place or to bring their culture to do something or something like that. So there is no any immigrants problem with that. Yes, mostly Russian populace see immigrants and feel some kind of tension to it, to not only to the ex-Soviet Republic, I mean, so to the, for example, to the representatives of the Uzbekistan, Republic of Uzbekistan, or Kyrgyzstan, or Tajikistan, something like that, but also to the Caucasian Republic, who is now each is inside of Russia, yes, the part of the Russian region. So this anti-immigrant sentiments is more important, but it's not now, brought to the representative of the Global South, because there are no so many Global South representatives in Russia in terms of working in Russia or something like that. And also which I see from the research, that now Russia, especially in different cultural institutions, try to promote that some kind of Global South culture, Chinese especially, but not only, some African culture is rich enough to cooperate with Russian culture. Yeah, something like that. So, for example, several festivals were organized this year in Russia. Also, I think that you know that there exists in this Russia-Africa summit, which now less about the economy, but more about the cultural value and something like that. And these issues promoted through the propaganda a lot. So they try to position the Global South as the advantage and the partner, maybe not senior partner, but junior partner of Russia, to prevent these kind of sentiments which you refer to. So the second question, about how valid is argument in Russian ideology in terms of fighting neocolonialism, but Russia practices neocolonialism in terms of Ukraine. So this is a good point. Frankly, I don't know the answer because I haven't seen this discussion when the representatives of the global South countries ask Russia, are you really anti-colonial or not? So I'm not sure that this discussion will was happen quite often. But yes, I think that you are partly right that this less coherency in the Russian ideology, of course, is existing, and maybe so some countries of the global south see this contradiction and believe that so the anti-colonial vibe which the Kremlin now tried to present is not so true that they try to do.
Yeah, I think actually these questions some other ECFR fellows could answer. I suggest you all, now happy to plug some of our papers, look up what ECFR has written based on global polling. Mark Leonard, Ivan Krastyev, Pavel Zerka, sometimes Susie Dennison would be the authors. And I think the answer is actually that, colonialism is not the topic that would be associated with Russia for many out there in the world. And that pattern of thinking is hard to break. And also the war in Ukraine is not so important for the global south, so that they would actually start changing their sort of preset views because of that. It's just not their war, and yeah.
And also, Kadri, you are very modest and not to promote your paper on the Russian global south, but I can promote your paper, and which by the way, I refer several times in my paper too. So please read the Kadri's paper, how the European Union or the Europe and the West can fight with the attempts of the Russian influence on global south. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Well, that's not what I was expecting when I joined that seminar. But now I will get back to all of you, starting with András for final words, any remaining comments. And I would also want to leave 2 last questions with you. If you want to address them or not, up to you. And to me, these questions are actually about desperation and hopelessness. There is a question, to what extent would you agree that explaining that war can be explained with a dependence of Russia's state budget on fossil fuels and realization of various elites that such dependence is doomed, so the war is desperate move by them? And another question is, how do you expect the Russian soul to evolve? Zvyagintsev's Leviathan is not simply about power, but also culture. How could they help 100+ million people to evolve positively? I mean, Zvyagintsev hit a note with me because I think Zvyagintsev Leviathan actually really explains quite a lot about life in Russia. And to me, the main message of this movie was hopelessness. If you haven't seen it, watch. I will not start retelling it, but it's striking that there is not even conflict between good and evil. The movie starts with a mediocre situation, and then everything gets slowly only worse, and that is portrayed as sort of inevitable development that stems from human condition itself. To me, that was actually a really significant movie about Russia. So it's interesting that this is brought up also again in the context of our conversation. Yeah, up to you if you have anything to say about it or not. But now, final round of comments, and let's start with András.
Yeah, thank you. So I will try to be quick. First of all, the questions. So the explaining the war with the dependence on Russia's budget on fossil fuels. Well, I honestly don't think that this was the case. Not only because of what we know about how the war itself was prepared and how many people knew about decisions and could influence those decisions, but also because the war essentially accelerated Russia's weaning itself off of these resources, in the sense that it lost export markets in Europe. It had to reorient its oil exports to Asia, which was partially successful, of course, but under conditions that were not ideal. And if the elites had wanted to, or if the central government had wanted to build a new elite consensus based simply on new distribution of resources and access to resources, which is, by the way, happening, obviously. So to that extent, it is true that there is now a new war-based resource distribution mechanism going on, but there were other ways. There was an alternative development scenario in which the war chest would have been spent on development projects, the national projects, for instance, or there were other scenarios like Shoigu's building cities in Siberia, for instance, around industrial clusters was one of these alternative development models. So that's my comment on that. As for Zvyagintsev, and I agree, it's a great movie. To me, actually, one thing that movie also says is that people are going to try to influence their surroundings as much as they think they can. And I think that, to a certain extent, is still happening in Russia on the local level. Politics has been competitive politics has been pushed out from the federal level, mostly from the regional level until by now. And a lot of it is happening on local levels, and it is still, to a certain extent, happening. There's still civil grassroots organizations campaigning for local causes. I don't have a good answer to how the Russian soul, if there is such a thing, even will evolve or should evolve. But I think when we are talking about the democratic revival, these remaining grassroots organizations and civil society have to be part of that. And I think the West needs to actively help these survive, not co-opt them, but to ensure that those Russians who do want to change the situation, even just around themselves or on higher levels, have the tools and the information to do so. And just a couple of fleeting thoughts. So first of all, Mikhail, I take your point. You're completely right that fairness is coming up more and more often in this sort of ideological discussion. I think this is also, in a way, it's what we might a little bit disagree over, but maybe not even that, is the frame of this. I see this as part of the Kremlin's trying to control that kind of growing anti-elitism, which we saw also the shadows of in Prigozhin's mutiny and the discourse around Prigozhin prior to the mutiny. I sort of, because of that, I also link this to Putin's speeches about the new elite that would be war participants, which is mostly so far has taken forms like war participants getting access to, or promised access at least to, free public transportation or similar goodies or lots in the Far East. But when it comes to actually elevating them to administrative political elites, it hasn't really worked out so far. So I would say, like, we will see how far that goes in practice. It's certainly there, so you're completely right about that, and it's just the time pressure that I didn't mention it. And I think for all of the other issues, just one more thing, the neocolonialism. This is obviously a flawed parallel, but I just want to also highlight that in Hungary, Orbán's first framing of the war was that this was an intra-Slavic conflict, that we did because in Hungary too, you would have expected people to react very strongly emotionally, given that the country was several times overrun by the armies of various Russian-led empires during its history. And the explanation was that this has nothing to do with us because this is an intra-Slavic conflict. And so I think as long as this anti-colonialism is part of the civilizationist narrative, it has a sort of weird internal logic when it says that the global South does not have to concern itself with Russian colonialism as long as it happens within Russia's cultural space or civilizational space. And I think that as long as you have material interests in signing off for that, you will. It is there. It is. I see no contradictions there. It's obviously a flawed explanation from our point of view, but in its own way, it makes sense. So I will close with this, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. Ksenia, fairly briefly, anything final to say?
Yes, I hope my connection is not as bad as it was before. Well, about the field of Zvyagintsev, of course, it's a very good metaphor of all Russian reality. I traveled a lot all over Russia before the war, of course, before the exile, and I can say that it's a very good film that is completely truth. So I'm not a big optimist at all, and I think that the biggest problem is that Putin's regime consistently forced the bedded people would say so simple words, and it's not limited to the borders of Russia, unfortunately. And everywhere where there are some kind of anti-Western sentiments, there will be a place for Russian propaganda and ideological influence. We saw that some days ago in Bulgaria, they elected a new patriarch, a completely pro-Russian person. It was a surprise even because he was not only pro-Russian, but pro-war. And he's rather young, so he will stay, well, for a lot of years as the head of the Bulgarian church. And he's definitely under the Russian influence. He's a big friend of Russian church. So that's only one example, the recent example of this influence.
Thank you. And Mikhail, also quite briefly, any final words?
Very briefly. Frankly, I'm not an expert of the Russian soul. mostly maybe on the Russian body, not the Russian soul. Yeah, but so other sum up to our discussion today. Maybe what I would like to highlight, and which is quite important in advocating this issue among the Western and European institutions, if we would like to prevent or fight with this increasing level of ideologization inside of Russia, I think that the Western countries should try to demonstrate, especially to the youth population in Russia, that the West is not completely lost for them. Unfortunately, now we see that Western reaction, especially in the United States or in the European Union, on what's Russia, the Kremlin did in Ukraine, is quite strict to the Russian population too. So not so all population support the war, of course. And if we would like to have to increase the chance to the democratic future in Russia, we should keep in mind that we should demonstrate the broader Russian populace that we distinguish or difference, make the difference between Russian state and Russian population, and to demonstrate to the Russian population that the idea of the state civilization or the new world which leading by Russia is not the only one idea which can be promoted, but also that Russia and the European Union in particular can demonstrate it, that Russia is the part of the European family, yeah, and it will help, I guess, a lot to prevent Russian ideological indoctrination in the future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This is perfect point to finish. Also echoes my permanent message that our best way to influence Russia is to make democracy work well and function in the West, because Russians, they still observe the West. Even if they reject us in the model, they observe us with critical jealousy. So that's a way to influence their thinking as well. Thank you very much. Thank you all the speakers. Thank you, Mikhail, for the paper. I think we had a really good conversation, and sorry about going over time. I felt it was worth it. And happy summer, everyone.